How about that, huh? My goodness, Steve was right. I mean, what a powerful week. What an awesome week. Again, Vacation Bible School was a super success. Thank you to all the volunteers and for all of those who made that happen and made this week unfold. And from the folks in the kitchen, that was just super. Food every night was great, and all the folks that were teaching and leading kids around. Those of you that were sweating it out outside in recreation, man, if you've never seen Keith Bennett blow bubbles, man, it rivals curtain operation in a way that you can't imagine, okay? I mean, it's really cool stuff. There's form into it, so you got to see that. And so everybody that made it all happen, I mean, it was just super, and all the way through. We had 3 young people who gave their heart to Christ this week. That was super. We got to meet with all of them, and Tim shared the gospel with them on Thursday night. I sat down with each of those kids and talked with them, and we're following up with their parents now about baptism for them. And so that's just awesome. And so it was a great week. You know, summer is getting by really quick. And for a school teacher, Everett Brown used to say when he would walk into the Walmart and see a back-to-school sign, he would break out in hives. For me, whenever I see Wimbledon on SportsCenter or on ESPN, it makes me a little nervous because I know that it's coming quick. And so we've had a great summer traveling. We've got about 3 more weeks left, and we're going to make the most of that. And so, but it's coming really fast. And one of the cool things this summer for our Growing Academy is Nathan and Sheena have been teaching. The men and the women have been separated in 2 different rooms, and the ladies have been studying women of the Bible. And Nathan has been leading a group of men that have been studying the men of the Bible. And it's been very well received, and I've been able to sit in on a couple, and so it's really been a great study. And so when I was praying about where God would direct us and where we would go as we came to this, leading up to our Operation Inasmuch and our 20th anniversary, where God would have us, He laid this on my heart, and I had heard this and studied this over the past few months, and I've been looking at this and researching and reading, and we're going to look at a character from the Old Testament, King David. And we're going to be looking at his life and his leadership and what I believe is Israel's greatest king. And we're going to dive into his life as we go through these next few weeks. And I hope that that will be something that God will use as he has already enlightened me and really helped me as I have studied for this and looked at it. You know, the thing about David is his story takes place in the 11th century BC. And David lived in what was a very violent world. You know, we talk about a lot of times that whenever we turn on the TV, turn on the news, it's violence everywhere, and we see riots, and we see gangs, and we see all these things, and it troubles us and bothers. But listen, David's world, the world of the Old Testament, the 11th century, when it come to warfare, when it come to what those guys dealt with and how they fought on the battlefield, we don't have a clue. Okay, we simply do not have a clue to the level of violence and what that world was like. We can't understand it, because when you talk about an ancient battle, when you talk about those kinds of things, you can't just read about it and understand it. You know, ancient warfare has been glamorized, it's been sanitized, and it's been romanticized and fictionalized, and Hollywood has helped. When Braveheart came out several years ago, some of you I'm sure have seen that, and that kind of took it to a step, and then Gladiator came out and kind of took it to another step. But unless you've experienced it, you really have no idea. I have no idea. You see, because in modern warfare, we kill from a distance. And I think, you know, Vietnam was the first war that really kind of came into our living rooms, where we saw some of the things that were taking place. And when I was coming out of high school, the first Gulf War, you guys remember the press conferences that General Norman Schwarzkopf used to share on television, he and Colin Powell. I used to call them this guy's about to have a bad day press conference. He would show those videos from the nose of the smart bombs and show them driving right into somebody's house or into some of the places that we were bombing over there. But that's thousands of miles away. In ancient warfare, you were looking into the eyes and smelling the breath of your opponent. You were right there. Now, none of us have experienced that. Okay, none of us have experienced a place where we are going into battle and it's either kill or be killed, and you're looking into someone's eyes, and so these guys would go out there. Some of them would have to do things to try to prepare themselves for battle, and most of them were terrified. Most of them were scared beyond belief whenever they walked on. Their stomach would be in their throat, and they just knew that if one little thing could go wrong, and if everything didn't go just right, then they weren't going to come off that battlefield alive. And as you went out onto that ancient battlefield, as you went out behind the shield wall, and as they came together with swords and spears and shields, when you looked into the eyes of your opponent, if you didn't see fear, if you saw dead calm, if you were looking into the eyes of somebody that was looking at you with dead calm, you knew you were in trouble. Because what you were looking into the eyes of was a trained killer, a veteran of the shield wall that was going to do you in. And if you weren't a veteran, you weren't coming off the battlefield that day. Most of the men who fought on those ancient battlefields, we romanticize it and do it in pictures, and I'm kind of glad we do, because most of those guys didn't even hardly wear clothes, because they didn't understand a lot of things about infection or germs, but they knew that if you got stabbed or you got cut and it put a piece of fabric or a piece of cloth or a piece of leather or something inside of your skin, under your skin, that it would develop infection, and if it was in your hand or in your arm or on your legs, that you would lose that limb. Most likely you would have an infection, you would lose your life. At the end of the battle, you would be so fired up on adrenaline. If you survived and got off of the battlefield, you would be so filled with adrenaline that you would have to look and see if the blood that was on you was yours or your opponent's. But you can rest assured that when you came off that battlefield, you were going to be covered in blood. And if your person that was beside you, if your fellow soldier to your left or to your right got scared and ran away, then that was going to free up that person to come after you, and you weren't going to make it off that battlefield. Can you imagine? And if you were killed on the battlefield, if you were cut down on that battlefield, before somebody could come and take your body, before somebody would come and prepare you or take you and bury you, then the birds of the air and the beasts of the field would come and feast on you. That's your Bible story, kids. Isn't that pleasant? Huh? It's VBS week, right? Yeah, it's hard to take, isn't it? It's hard to take. That is the world, and that is the backdrop to the story that we're going to share today, because that is the potential battlefield that David walked onto. The story is told to us in 1 Samuel in chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. This was one of the first accounts we see here of David and what he presents as a leader. The Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah, and they pitched their camp at Ephes Damim between Socoh and Azekah. And so here they are, and Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. So that one of these ancient battles is being prepared. It's about to happen. And the Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley there between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, he came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That's taller than Nathan Phelps, okay? He's a tall guy. It's about 9.5 feet tall. And he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. This was one big bad dude. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. It's about 15 pounds. His shield bearer went ahead of him. What a dude. This guy was huge. And he would come out, and he would taunt. And here, think about this. Nathan and Bubby, I saw them. I thought they were hugging, but they weren't the other night. They were comparing reach, okay? And these guys have got some reach, okay? And you think about Goliath's reach. He's 9.5 feet tall. What are you, 7'3" reach, something like that? 7 foot? What? Yeah, about 7'3". Okay, that's a big reach. Now Goliath is 9.5 feet tall, so his reach was, and his spear was 6 foot long with a 15-pound tip. But Goliath didn't have to stand on the front row. Goliath could stand behind the front row in the second rank and reach with his spear over those guys and just kill and kill and kill. I mean, this guy's massive and powerful. And so the Israelites are looking, going, what are we going to do? Because here's the problem that was presented. This was not going to be an open battle, because this was what Goliath did. Verse 8, he comes to them, and this is what he says. Goliath gives them a challenge of what's going to take place. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, verse 8. There we go. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. One guy. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our servants and serve us. Then the Philistine said, this day this is important, this will come back later, let's watch this. This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And you would be too. And you would be too. All right? He wants one guy, this 9.5-foot giant with a 6-foot spear and a 15-pound point who can reach out and touch someone. He wants one guy to come down there. And you've got a sword and your own spear, and how close can you get to him before he's got you? Here I am. And they didn't know what to do with it. And so he would do that day after day after day for weeks. He kept coming out. He kept coming out. And Israel looked to their king, King Saul. You see, when you go back and study the appointment and the anointing of King Saul, there were 2 reasons that King Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel. Okay? Number 1, he was a good-looking guy. All right? Number 2, and more importantly, he was taller than everybody else. He was a head taller than every other Israelite that was there. And so, when you got a 9.5-foot giant that's taunting you and wants to fight one person, who are you going to look for? You're going to look for your tallest guy. And it was their king. And Saul wasn't really having it. He's camped out in his tent, and he's not coming out. And so Israel is looking to their king, and he's absent from this account. He's absent from this story. You see, it was their king that they had placed their hope in. They had placed their hope in a king. Isn't it amazing how God orchestrates things? You see, they had placed their hope in a king, and that's what they should have done, because they had invested in him and they had supported him, and here he was. And so they were waiting for their king to come out of his tent and challenge Goliath. And this is where our story, okay, this is where my story, and this is where your story begins to intersect the Old Testament. Because what is true of you and what is true of me is that we will place our hope in what we depend on. We will place our hope in what we depend on. And it's just what we do. We place our hope in who we depend on, and when that person that we place our hope in disappoints us in some way, it doesn't work out the way we think it should work out, it's oftentimes the measure of our hope then becomes the measure of our disdain. And this is why that we have the potential to disappoint our parents the most. Okay? Because when we're young, we put our hope in our parents. And when it doesn't work out the way we think it should, we become disappointed, and then we become rebellious. Okay? Some of you guys are in parenting right now, and so you understand what I'm talking about. When you send your kid that drives you crazy to a neighbor's house or to a friend's house, and they come back home, and you're kind of nervous, and you're like, how'd they do? And they're like, they were the best behaved little kid. You know, when you send them to school, and you go in for a parent-teacher conference, and you're like, oh, this is not going to go well, and then the teacher comes, he is an angel. I wish I had all of mine like him. And you're sitting there going, I knew it was in him, but I don't ever see it, and I would really like to see it. And it's because they have put their trust and their hope in you, and things maybe not have worked out according to their plan. Your parents can make you so mad sometimes, but you're always polite to your neighbors, and you continue to be polite to your neighbors. And so what happens is when we place our trust, that is where our hope is. And where we place our hope, then that is where our trust is. And so they had placed their hope, they had placed their trust in King Saul. And he is absent. He has not come out of his tent. He has not developed a plan. He doesn't have anything for them. Okay? And so every day that Saul doesn't come out, every day that he doesn't have a plan, every day that goes by that he doesn't challenge Goliath, then the dependence and the hope of Israel begins to wane down. And the army's morale begins to sink, and their hope begins to sink, and everything, and Saul's credibility begins to decline. And here's the thing. God allowed this. Okay, because there's a little history lesson. Here you have the Philistine army, and you have the Israelite army in this stalemate, and they're led by King Saul. And the thing about it is that God never intended for Israel to have a king. All right? God created Israel as a theocracy. He gave them His law, and then He appointed judges over them. And that was God's plan. And they were thousands of years ahead of the rest of the world. But that's not the world that they lived in. The world that they lived in had kings. And they also wanted a king. And so they come to Samuel, who was the prophet, and they had come out of Egypt, and so they had seen all these things, and they had this idea, and they decided that they needed a king. And so we find this story of how Saul came to power and how this happened in 1 Samuel. We back up a few chapters, 1 Samuel 8 and verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leader. He knew his time was growing short, and he knew he needed to do something, so he appointed his sons. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons didn't follow his ways. They were corrupt. Okay, they were corrupt, and they turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes. So they interpreted laws. They were the judges over the people of Israel. But if you had enough money, to pay them off, then you would get what you wanted. And so they were corrupt, and that created problems, and they perverted justice. And so what happened is all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And this is what they said to him. You are old. I hope I never hear that, but I'm going to someday. You are old, and your sons don't follow your ways. Now what we want is we want you to appoint a king to lead us like all the other nations have. All the cool kids have a king, and we want a king. And this hurt Samuel. This hurt him. And he didn't want this. When they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, and so he turned to the Lord. He turned to the Lord. And this is what the Lord told him. Listen to all that the people are saying to you. He said, Samuel, it's not you that they're rejecting. It's not you that they're rejecting. They've rejected me. God said this to Samuel. They have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. And now, Samuel, they're doing it to you. They're doing it to you. So listen to them. They want a king? Give them a king. Okay? Give them a king. But warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Be sure and tell them, Samuel, that this king that they want is going to take their money in taxes, that this king that they want is going to take their kids and put them on the battlefield, that this king that they want is going to do things for his own gain. Warn them of what this means and what this is going to be when they want a king. So Samuel warned them. He warned them. And at the end of his warning, they looked at Samuel and said, we want a king. Because, you see, God had established Israel for a very special reason. He had established the nation of Israel for a special reason. God had told Abraham all the way back at the beginning, when he called Abram to leave his home, he said, I am going to bless the entire world through your descendants. The whole world through you, Abraham. Through your descendants, the whole world will be blessed. And God intended for the entire nation of Israel that when anybody looked at them, when any other nation looked at Israel and said, why are they so successful? How are they able to win that battle? How are these things able to happen? It's not going to be because of their king. It's going to be because of their God, who is the Lord. And that's what he wanted to see. He wanted everyone to see that he was their king. But yet they turned to Samuel and said, we want a king. So Samuel anointed Saul as Israel's first king. David would become Israel's second king. And I believe, arguably, is Israel's greatest king. Not because he was perfect. Not because he was flawed. As a matter of fact, he had a lot of flaws, like me. It was not because of his talent. He was talented. But here's the thing. I believe that David was Israel's greatest king because he never forgot who God was. You see, David loved the law. He loved the law, and unlike most kings who made their own laws, most kings wanted to be the law. I am the law, you see. And if they broke the law, they would just change the law to adjust them. David never did that. David subjected himself to God's law, even when it condemned him. And throughout his reign, David loved the law, and he allowed himself to be broken by it. And it was because of that conviction, it gave David the ability to have extraordinary perspective throughout his reign. And throughout his reign, David made mistakes, but he never changed the law like so many kings do, and he allowed himself to be broken. He was never confused throughout his reign, even the mistakes that he made. When we study, we're going to study this for about 5 weeks, and so when we study different times, there's going to be times where David made mistakes, but in those times, he was never confused about who Israel's true king was, that it was God. David never lost sight of that. He never lost sight of that. He was never confused about his limited power. And despite of his popularity, despite of his talent and skill, he was never confused about who Israel's true king was. And here's the thing. This is what happens to so many of us. When we experience a little bit of success, whether it's a success in our careers, or whether it's success in life, whether it's financial success or whatever it is, the moment that we begin to experience a little bit of success, then we find ourselves sitting on the throne of our own lives. But David never made that mistake. He never made that mistake. And we catch a glimpse of that in the story that we are looking at today. Because here we are. We've looked at Goliath and the challenge that has been presented, and now David enters the story, and we're going to pick it up in verse 23. He comes to the battlefield as a 15-year-old boy. He doesn't even have a permit. He can't even drive himself, to the battlefield. He has to go. And so he goes with a care package from his dad. He takes a care package and he goes to it because his brothers were veterans in Saul's army, and they come onto the battlefield. And in 1 Samuel chapter 17 in verse 23, this is what we find. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, the same thing that we'd already heard and we've already read. And David heard it. So David has just now come to the battlefield, and he's come to bring a care package to his brothers. And so all of a sudden he hears, and this is his reaction. We see his reaction in verse 26. Because when the Israelites saw him, they get scared. And David asked the men standing near him. This is what he said. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? What were you talking about? The 9.5-foot giant that kills and kills and kills with his 15-foot pound weight on the end of his spear? That guy, disgrace from Israel. Never really thought about. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is this one who is outside? That means he is outside the covenant of God. He is outside of the protection of God. Who does he think he is, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And here are all the armies of the living God. All these soldiers standing around scared out of their minds. And David comes onto the battlefield and goes, who does he think he is to stand out here and defy the armies of the living God? Extraordinary. Extraordinary perspective. Nobody else was looking at it that way. But David is offended. He is offended. What they saw was a 9.5-foot tall killing machine. What David saw was somebody who was outside of the covenant of God, who was defying the armies of the living God. And why in the world hasn't someone done something about this? Oh, wow. So here's this kid. And King Saul hears about it. He hears that somebody is kind of stepping up and wanting to challenge Goliath. And he's like, hey, sounds like a great plan to me. Bring him on in. Okay? Send the kid in, or send this guy in. Let's see who he is and what he's made of. And so all of a sudden he comes in, and we pick up that story in verse 31 when David comes to Saul, and he reports to Saul, And Saul sent for him, and he comes in. And David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And Saul looks him over, and he's like, "You're just a kid. You don't even have scars. You don't even have a shield. You don't have a sword. Who are you? You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a kid. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior since his youth. Have you not seen this guy? He's 9.5 foot tall." David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock," most shepherds would just kind of turn tail and run and get the rest of the sheep and just mark one up as a loss. Well, I didn't. I went after it. I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. I struck it, and I killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." Wow. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you, buddy." I don't know how you're going to do it, but you seem pretty convinced, because David had extraordinary vision and extraordinary clarity. There was no confusion in him. You see, David eventually reigned for 40 years as the king of Israel. And somehow he always had the clarity. And that's the thing, that when a man or woman, and this is something, this is a takeaway for today, when your hope is in the Lord, okay, you don't have a reason to fear. Because all of the other soldiers, including Saul, was looking at a 9.5 foot giant with a huge reach and a 6 foot spear and a 15 pound tip, thinking, how in the world can I even get close enough to this guy to inflict any harm at all? And so they were afraid, because their hope lay in their talents. Their hope lied in their skill. Their hope was in their ability to fight this giant by conventional means. And so because their hope was not in God, because their hope was not in the Lord, and for all those soldiers whose hope was in Saul, and Saul wasn't going to go down and fight him because he didn't think he could reach him either, everybody was hopeless. Later, David would become king, and he was also a poet and wrote extensively. And the really cool thing about the narratives of David's story is not only do we get the account of what David did, but we also get to peek into his heart. And the Bible tells us that David was a man after God's own heart. So when we look into David's heart, we're looking into the heart of God. And David wrote about this, and he gave us Psalm 25 and verse 1 and 2. And this is what David said: "In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. In you, Lord, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, or nor let my enemies triumph over me. It is in you that I put my trust." Where is your trust, David? In your power and your talent and your ability to fight this giant? We find in King David, and we discover that this posture that God wants you and me to maintain throughout our life. It's what He wants for us, is to put our hope and our trust in Him. So David makes his way down the valley to face Goliath. And can you imagine what both sides are thinking? Okay? I mean, here comes a 15-year-old kid without any armor, without anything. Saul had hung his stuff on him, and David's like, this is not me. This is not what I do. Okay? I got a slingshot. That's all I need. And so he goes down. And can you imagine Goliath and the guys behind him are looking and going, seriously? That's it. That's after weeks and weeks and weeks of taunting, and you guys being able to develop a game plan, train, do whatever, come up with whatever idea, the kid. You're sending us the kid to slaughter. That's great. This is going to be ugly. Y'all are not going to, you're going to remember this for years, what you're getting ready to see. And can you imagine the soldiers in the Israelite camp? Wait a minute. If he beats our guy, then we are subject to your rule. And this is all we're sending down. Way to go, Saul. That's great. You know, you should have stayed in the tent. Okay, we could have just lasted another week or two and come up with another plan. This is all we've got. So you got both sides looking at David and thinking this is ridiculous. Okay, both sides looking at David and thinking this is a ridiculous idea. But David had other plans, and this is what he did. Verse 45 is where we pick it up when he comes down. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands." I'm going to predict the future for you here, big guy. Okay, this is what's getting ready to happen. "And I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." Wow. All of those gathered there will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. And then he killed him, dead. And the Philistine army freaked out. Goliath the giant fell dead right in his tracks. David took his own sword, Goliath's sword, and cut off his head. And the Philistine army turned and ran. They turned and ran in fear. And the Israelite army overcame them and pursued behind them, and the slaughter lasted all day long. And the Israelites took everything that they had. And David instantly became the most popular man in Israel, because David saw something that Saul could not see. And this is the character of someone whose hope is in the Lord. Okay? The character of someone whose hope is in the Lord is this. First of all, they see clearly. Everybody else saw an impossible task, an impossible giant that was impossible to defeat. But people whose hope is in the Lord, they see clearly. And they act confidently. David didn't go down in that valley with a whole lot of iron, but he went down there with confidence. And he told Goliath what was getting ready to happen. He was warned. This is what's getting ready to happen. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut your head off. And the birds and the animals are going to eat you. And Goliath's probably thinking, "You're crazy." And that was the last thing he thought. They walk humbly. David strolled into Saul's tent and said, "Hey, I'm not a real warrior. I'm really not the battle. I know I'm not the battle. But listen, you guys have kind of lost sight of what's going on here. This guy is defying the armies of the living God. And the God that we serve is a big God. And I think He's going to deliver him into our hands. All we have to do is just do something. If you'll let me go down there, I think I got a plan." Okay? I think I got a plan. And so that's what people whose hope is in the Lord do. They recognize that they cannot control outcomes. When your hope is in God and when your trust is in God, you realize that you cannot control outcomes. People that walk with God wake up every day and realize that they can't control outcomes. And so every day they begin by saying, "In you, Lord, I put my trust. My hope is in you, Lord, all day long." You see, Taylor is getting married in December. And when she came to me and told me that this was going to happen, I was like, "Well, can we put it off to June? Can we do?" And so, because dads do that, right? And so we began to try to figure out some way. And so what we began to try to do is we began to try to control outcomes. And all of a sudden, and I can tell you, those of you who have little kids, wait till you get adult children, okay? Because the challenge begins to change. And some of you guys are shaking my head because you're veterans. You understand what I'm saying. You try to control outcomes. And this is the only thing. My prayer for her is that she would find someone who loved the Lord, because I know that the only thing that she wanted to ever do is to be a mom and to reach people for Jesus. That's all she's ever wanted to do. And I, God told me to plant that in her heart, and so I planted it in her heart. And I don't know what that's going to look like, okay? My future son-in-law right now is in a Syrian refugee camp in Lebanon teaching English to those refugees. What a heart, okay? When I'm 19 years old, the last place on my mind is teaching English to Syrian refugees anywhere in the world, okay? And the last place I was 19 years old was even reading English, okay? And that's where he is. So God has brought her somebody who has that heart to serve Him. Now, I look at it from the calculator standpoint and say, how are you going to eat? And where are you going to live? And how are you going to pay rent? And how are these things going to happen? Because Dad needs to control outcomes, right? No. Okay? No. We wake up every day and we say, my hope is in you, Lord. It's in you I put my trust. And I've given my kids to you, and you're going to have to take it and go with it. You know, I've been blessed. I have 2 careers, actually 3 because of the farm. But agriculture and farming has been one half of me, and the ministry and the love for the Lord and the things that I do in the ministry is the other half of me. And so I'm a split personality. But God has given me 2 beautiful girls that both characterize those sides of me. And Taylor, they both love the Lord, but Taylor wants to be in ministry. And Michaela loves the farm, and she loves the animals, and she loves those things that we do there. And so what a blessing. And I can't control what that looks like. Okay, I can't do that. I can't tell them exactly how to live their lives and where they're going to go and who they're going to marry and how this is all going to be. I can't control those outcomes. Ultimately, I just have to say, my hope is in you, Lord. And it's in you I put my trust. And realize that there's too many variables for me to be able to control. And so I have to put my trust in Him. When you put your hope in you and your world falls apart, all you have is despair. Last night was my 30th class reunion. And as I was going around the room and trying to touch base with as many as I could and catching up a little bit, and I came to one of our fellow classmates, and I had been told a few months ago that her husband had passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack. And so I wanted to just give her my condolences and just tell her that we had been praying. And the fact that she was even in the room was kind of blew my mind, that she could even come and be there. And when I began to talk to her, my gosh, she was so strong. And she has, her son is in finishing up law school, and her daughter is a sophomore at UK. And she has, by his passing, inherited a 200-acre, 200-cow cattle farm that she's managing on her own. Plus, she works in the school system. And I'm sitting there going, holy cow, how are you handling this? You know, and she gets her phone out and she showed me, she said, I just cut 4 acres of hay before I came down here. And she said, I didn't know how to cut hay. She said, but I've had to learn. And she's showing me pictures, and she showed me the picture of her of the tree. Her husband was cremated, and they buried his ashes under this beautiful oak tree and built this fence around it. And she's showing me pictures of all this. And then she looked at me, and I began to reflect on today's message, and I was like, oh my gosh, if your hope was only in your husband, you would be in despair and tears somewhere and not standing here talking to me. But she said, it's my faith that gives me my strength. She said, I got to do this. I got to do this. And so he shows me how. And I was thinking, my gosh. Because when you put your hope in your spouse, when you put your hope in your parents, when you put your hope in your career, when you put your hope in your retirement plan, when you put your hope in finances, when you put your hope in all of those things, when that goes away, you're left in despair. But listen, God has promised, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so if you put your hope in Him and trust in Him, He's always there. He's always there. And if you'll hang on to Him, He'll get you through whatever comes your way. When you put your hope in the Lord, you can live with confidence in the midst of despair. So, final question for you. My hope is. How do you finish that sentence? How do you personally finish that sentence? I hope that you can say, my hope is in you, Lord. It's in you I put my trust. Let me pray for you. Father, we love you. We thank you for this story that you've given us, Father, of great trust in you. King David is just a 15-year-old little boy going to the battlefield and facing what is seemingly an impossible task. He put his trust and his hope in you, and you delivered Goliath into his hands. Not because he was a great warrior, not because he was anything special. He was just obedient, and he trusted in you. Lord, this morning, I don't know where we are in our hearts. I don't know where we stand, but you do. You knew where David stood, and you know where we are. Father, maybe we're putting our trust and our hope in things other than you. And Father, when those things fade away, we're left with despair. So Father, I pray this morning that we would search our hearts, and Father, that we would realize that our hope needs to lie with you. And Father, if it's not there, Father, maybe today, maybe during this time of invitation and reflection, we just need to re-up. We just need to let go of some things. Quit trying to control outcomes, and quit trying to control all the variables. Father, advice is okay, and godly wisdom is important, and we pour that into our children. We pour that into those people that are around us. But ultimately, Father, they belong to you. They're your kids, and you love them infinitely more than we do, and it's hard for us to understand that. But you do. So we just have to do what you've called us to do. But ultimately, our hope and our trust lies with you. Guide us now, Father, as we respond and reflect. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Please stand.